Great to see everyone here for this panel discussion, and I hope lots of good questions around Uplands, national parks and climate change. My name's Beccy Speight. I'm the Chief Executive of the RSPB, and I'm temporarily chairing this panel until Daniel Zeichner arrives. He's hot-footing it across from somewhere else, so you'll have to put up with me for a while. It's a great panel. We've got some really interesting views represented, I think. So we've got, on my left, we've got Hilary Benn, MP for Leeds Central. Obviously has a long history around this discussion topic. And when he was at DEFRA, Secretary of State was particularly involved in putting the groundbreaking Climate Change Act onto the statute book, of course. And then on my right, we've got Helen Goodman, who is MP for Bishop Auckland and still valiantly finishing her lunch. And she is particularly a champion, I know, of sheep farmers, of course, from where you are, and peatland restoration as well. So there'll be some interesting viewpoints, I think, from that. And she's patron of the North East Call to Action on Global Poverty and Climate Change as well. To her right, we have Sandy Martin, who is valiantly standing in for Sue Hayman, who has been called to other things. Sandy's the MP for Ipswich, and he's shadow DEFRA lead on waste and resources. I think, Sandy, that's right? Yeah. And has very nobly stepped in at the last minute, which is fantastic, so thank you for that. And then at the far end, we've got Neil Heseltine, who is a farmer. He's a fourth-generation upland farmer from Malham, North Yorkshire, and he's part of the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, which is quite a recent movement of farmers who believe that they want to restore nature as well as generate livelihoods for themselves from farming. So I'm sure he's got some interesting views to give us as well. If you want to tweet about this, I've been given about 10 million hashtags. So I'm going to just give them to you because otherwise I'll get told off. We've got hashtag SERA Lab 19. We've got hashtag climate crisis, hashtag Lab 19. And then I've got to put in hashtag RSPB News as well. So you can take your pick from those if you tweet. I thought I would just kick off by saying a few words from the RSPB's perspective. And then we'll kick off with some thoughts from each of the panel members and then open it up to questions as well. So I thought I would start off just by saying today is equinox. It's the autumn equinox today, which is a time of balance. It's a time of balance, Hilary. When the sun's path crosses the celestial equator. So it's a time of balance in terms of light and dark. And I kind of wish it felt a bit more like that, sitting where we're all sitting right now. But it's just a moment to kind of reflect on the fact that nature is doing its thing while all of this goes on. And of course, we can't kind of sit here and talk about the topics we're going to be talking about without two things, I think, banging around in our heads. One is the recently released Glover review of national parks and AONBs. That came out overnight on Friday, came into the press, I think, on Saturday as well. And then, of course, the youth climate strike on last Friday. I was certainly out in Nottingham, and I'm sure lots of you were out as well. It was a pretty phenomenal thing, actually. And you've only got to look at the global coverage around the world to see the scale of feeling that was being expressed, particularly by young people, but they'd invited adults to join them as well, about the climate crisis that we're facing into and the nature crisis, of course, that sits hand in hand with that. So those two things, for me, very much kind of frame today's debate. And then we've had some amazing reports that have come through in the last kind of 18 months, really, telling us what we need to worry about. IPCC, IPBES, we've had the Climate Change Committee's advice to our own government about what should be happening. And they have both made it incredibly clear that the climate crisis and the ecological crisis are absolutely hand in hand, both in terms of the impacts that are happening, but in terms of solutions as well. So I hope that we're going to hear quite a lot about nature solutions today, because that's where we've got a huge opportunity, I think, in terms of tackling both those crises at the same time. And of course, we sit here still under the threat of a no-deal exit in terms of Brexit. I'm sure I don't need to remind you that, you know, the environment sector has huge worries about what that might mean. We've got the Environment Bill we put a lot of work into in the build-up to this moment. We've got the Ag Bill, which is now looking like it's not going to happen, but had some hugely important senses of direction in it around public money for public goods. And we know that we kind of run a risk if we move into a no-deal situation of a race to the bottom in terms of trying to get trade deals and what that might mean for the environment as well. So that is, of course, another huge piece of context for us. So I just wanted to talk a bit about natural climate solutions. And the RSPB has done an interesting piece of work looking at how much carbon is captured in the vegetation and just the top 30 centimetres of soil in our most important areas for nature in the UK. And lo and behold, the two frequently tie together. If you map our most important areas in terms of nature and you map our most important areas in terms of carbon, they overlap. But we've also found that 66% of that carbon in those nature-rich areas lies outside protected areas. So we've got some protected areas where already we know a lot is in unfavourable condition. So when Natural England did its last survey in 2006, we knew that even the protected areas were in unfavourable condition. And we also know that a lot of that carbon lies outside those protected areas as well. And if we lost that carbon from those areas, we would lose 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that's equivalent to 4 years of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions if we lost that. So those areas are incredibly important. And right now, we're not doing enough to protect them or to recover them. And that's a huge issue. And they're in that bad state because of past practice in terms of acidification, in terms of recreational disturbance, drainage, but we've also got current issues going on in terms of intensity of land use in those areas, so intensity of agriculture, intensity of the shooting and the commercial shooting in particular, and also intensity of things like drainage and burning. So we've got quite a lot going on in the uplands that means that we're going backwards rather than forwards in terms of nature recovery. But we are doing good work in terms of trying to make a difference. So if I just dance you through a few examples, in the Flow country, Caithness and Sutherland, that of course was the victim of a huge commercial forestry push in the 1980s. And those of you who are old enough to remember, there are quite apocryphal kind of videos of people sticking in commercial forestry while peat is just being ploughed behind on the camera. That's 4 kilometres squared. It's the biggest area in the world in terms of blanket bog, and there's a huge restoration project going on there. 2 million trees still to come out, but a huge restoration piece going on there at the moment to get that blanket bog into better condition. If you think of things like the cairngorms, you've got ancient Caledonian pinewood. So there's a big project going on at the moment there. You've got Scots pine, birch, rowan, alder, willow, lots of heather moorland, and trying to expand that area and also, again, block ditches, stop the drainage of that area, keep it wet where it needs to be wet and keep the carbon in the ground. Of course, the Pennines and the North York Moors coming down the UK. So that's England's largest area of blanket bog in the Pennines and the North York Moors. Only 14% of that SSSI is in good condition. And again, that's drainage, heather burning, overgrazing. So lots of blocking of drains, lots of bog vegetation restoration, putting back sphagnum, putting back cotton grass, making sure that that vegetation is in a better state. And if you come down to the Wash, on the eastern side of England, come down to the Wash and the North Norfolk coast, you've got intertidal salt marsh there, so coastal realignment. We know that's going to be a big issue as we face into climate change. And there's land reclamation that's gone on in the past, and really that's about trying to allow water back in to create better areas for wildlife, but also to hang on to the carbon and get more carbon being stored in that salt marsh going forward. And we estimate we're going to need about 5 times increase in rate of realignment than we've had since 2000. So coastal realignment is going to be really important going forward. And then just moving down to somewhere like the Chilterns. So interestingly, the Chilterns was one of the areas that the Glover Review suggested could become a national park. It's currently in AOMB at the moment. And the Chilterns is a really good example of more southerly areas where we've got sort of fragmented nature. We've got fragmented nature, grassland, woodland, but actually it's not protected. It's not protected well enough at all at the moment. And I think we run a big loss of losing those fragmented areas where we haven't got that overarching protection. So, this is the situation we find ourselves in when we think particularly about the uplands and blanket bog, but think about national parks and our protected areas. And it is about intensity of land use, I think. So it is about intensity of agriculture, intensity of tree planting, intensity of shooting. And I think the situation we've got to look into is one where land needs to deliver on a multitude of purposes for us going forward. And that's actually, it is a social justice issue. It's about land delivering across the board for people. And we've got to, I think, make some quite big shifts to enable that to happen. It is, I think, without doubt, the fight against climate change and the fight against species loss is the fight of our generation. I know there's a lot going on around Brexit at the moment, but it is, in my mind, that is a distraction. It is the fight of our generation. We have to get this right. And we need to be doing a lot more and spending a lot more in order to do that. So there's been some work done with the National Trust and with the Wildlife Trust recently that indicates that £3 billion, which is the amount we spend under cap at the moment on farming, absolutely needs to go into restoring nature through farming going forward. And we've also done another piece of work that looks at how much of GDP should be spent on trying to tackle climate change and tackle the loss of nature, and we estimate it needs to be about 2% of GDP going forward. So that's going up from about 17 billion to about 42 billion a year. Sounds a lot of money, but actually in relative terms, it's 2% of GDP. So that's the kind of shift I think we need to make. I think in terms of kind of listening to the science is really clear around this. We need to listen to it, we need to respond, we need to move at scale, and we need to do it now. That's enough from me. And our chair has arrived, Daniel. Okay, I'm going to hand over chairing, but I was going to ask Hilary to speak first.
Well, that's a very good clue as to my direction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Daniel Zeichner, Member of Parliament for Cambridge and a long-term SERA member, and I'm going to do no more than hand over to my wonderful colleague, Hilary Benn. Hilary.
Well, do I have to use? Oh, I've got this. Yes, so I don't have to use that. Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Beccy, Daniel, thank you very much for inviting us here today. Now, we can't meet in Brighton in what will be the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the last of the national parks, the South Downs National Park, without commemorating that occasion. I'm greatly looking forward, as I've just been reminded by a colleague at the back, to going down to Ditchling in November, on November that's the date we've got in the diary, because it was at the tea rooms in Ditchling, hands up who's familiar with the tea rooms in Ditchling, wonderful place, that I decided that we would go and sign the legal documents that created the South Downs National Park. And since at least one of the campaigners for it is in the room, I want to thank all of those who fought for that park and all of the other national parks. The last in the sense that there was a long list that a man called Arthur Hobhouse drew up prior to the passing of the National Parks Act in 1949, another anniversary that we celebrate this year. And it was one of the many achievements of the last Labour government. And the reason I went to the Ditchling tea rooms is because when the second inspector's report arrived on my desk, and it was sort of this big, and the officials said, well, there are various places where the inspector has said it's up to you to decide whether the land is in or out of the national park. And this shows how politics can make a difference. So I said to the officials, right, okay, well, we better go have a look. And a visage of horror appeared on the face of my officials and said, Secretary of State, I beg your pardon, what do you mean, go have a look? I said, well, I'm going to go have a look if I'm going to decide whether the land should be in or out. But you can't do that. It was like an episode of Yes, Minister. I said, why can't you do that? Because you might talk to people. And they said, Minister, I need you to be aware that you are acting in a quasi-judicial capacity. And if you talk to someone, and it is then argued subsequently in court that that person influenced you in a direction other than recommended by the inspector and was in your own mind already, we could be in terrible trouble. So we reached a wonderful British compromise. And the compromise was if someone said good morning to me, I could say good morning back. And if someone said good afternoon, I could say good afternoon back. And we got in a charabanc, and we went to all of the places that were down to me to decide. And lo and behold, I came to the conclusion that all of them should be included in the national park, but that included Ditchling, because as we drove through Ditchling, away from Ditchling Beacon, if you know it, and the official said, you have to be satisfied the land to the north of Ditchling is national park quality in order to include Ditchling. Well, I very rapidly came to the conclusion. We turned the car around, we came back. And for those of you who've ever been there, as you come down the road, there is this beautiful crossroads with the buildings on the corner, and framed in front of you is the glory of Ditchling Beacon, and on the right, if you go down, are the famous tea rooms. And I said, right, we're going back to Ditchling to sign the documents, and I'll be interested to see whether the map is still on the wall in the tea room. But it shows the power of politics to bring about transformation. And the remarkable thing about the National Parks Act of 1949 was that at a time of rationing, huge destruction as a result of the Second World War, great economic crisis, a Labour government took a long-term decision to preserve beauty for posterity. Now that is the kind of leadership that we require in order to address the issues that Beccy just raised. And you referred kindly to the, not just the work on the National Park, but the Climate Change Act. And I'm absolutely delighted to peer, having just arrived in the room, Michael Jacobs, who is there, who played an enormously important part at number 10 Downing Street in creating the Department for Energy and Climate Change, in helping to get the Climate Change Act on the statute. But we were the first country in the world to do that. And the remarkable thing about the Climate Change Act is that we gathered in the Cabinet Room in Downing Street, and an agreement was reached that we would have an act before we had quite worked out exactly what was going to be in it. Now, I can assure you, in case you're lacking confidence in the way that Whitehall and government works, generally speaking, it's the other way around. But that was an act of political leadership, and it was the result of top-down political courage and commitment from Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Miliband, and others, and a bottom-up campaign run by Friends of the Earth called The Big Ask. And lo and behold, we were the first country in the world to do it. And the task, it seems to me, that we face now is a very practical one, but a huge challenge for our society, because the truth about humankind, we have many extraordinary gifts. And as you look around the world today, everything that you see, everything that we hold, everything that we live in, consume, has literally come from the earth on which we stand. Everything. And if our forebears and our ancestors who lived by hunting and gathering turned up now and looked around, they would be utterly astonished and say, where on earth did you get all this stuff from? And the answer is, we got it from the ground on which you gathered and you hunted. And the crisis that we're facing is that in the course of doing that, we have created a problem that in the end will threaten to engulf all of us wherever we live. And the truth about the climate change crisis, and I saw that with my own as the International Development Secretary, because I will always remember the day I met a group of people who had moved house because it had stopped raining where they were living. And they had pitched up in a Kenyan town on the outskirts, and they were living in these benders that they had made with twigs they had found, and they went to the town rubbish dump, and they collected scraps, cardboard, plastic, and they put them over the top of the benders. And I remember talking to a woman who had a baby in her arms, I think 5 other kids, and they were living in a bender of this diameter. Now, they did what human beings will do if you can no longer live where you were born and brought up, either because it stopped raining, or it's raining too much, or the water level has risen. They're going to be on the move in search of survival and a better life. And one of the great challenges of this century is going to be how we respond to the movement of people around the globe, unless we tackle the climate change crisis, the movement of people in search of a better life because they live in places where poverty is rampant, or there's insecurity, or war and conflict. That accounts for quite a number of the people who get into leaky boats on the north coast of Africa. And the only way we can do this is by working with others. And that's why Brexit, you're right, we spend a lot of time on it, we need to get it resolved. But having been the Environment Secretary who worked with European colleagues to put a commitment on the table at the Bali climate change talks in 2007, I saw with my own eyes how powerful it was for Europe to act as one. And this is a task that we'll only do by working with others, not by separating ourselves off. And I'm afraid some of the people behind Brexit, they're not interested in doing any of this. They'd like the rest of the world to go away. They have a completely different idea of our future as humankind, as a nation, and we cannot let them win. And the last thing I want to say is this. There is a very fine dividing line between grabbing the public's attention about the scale of the challenge, and I pay tribute to Extinction Rebellion. They've certainly grabbed people's attention. We had a huge crowd in Leeds last Friday, and it was amazing to see the turnout of people all around the world. It sent a very powerful message. There's a growing number of people who are concerned about this and doing the practical things that will bring about change. Now, I'm old enough to remember the man who used to walk up and down Oxford Street, and he had a sandwich board. And the words on it read, "The end is nigh." Remember that? Now, the trouble with reading a placard that says "the end is nigh" is you can look there and contemplate your ultimate and maybe immediate downfall. On the other hand, you can think, what am I going to have for tea for night when I get home? And the truth is, we need to encourage people to believe that this change is possible. And the reason why our national parks and the work that the RSPB does, and SERA and lots of other organisations, the Wildlife Trust movement, the National Trust, lots and lots of people up and down the country, is they are helping to build, farmers as well, helping to build that future bit by bit, plant by plant, breathing landscape by bit of breathing landscape. Because if we terrify ourselves, we run the risk of being immobilized. And most people, in my experience, when you say, hey folks, we've got a problem, will say, okay, well, show me how we can do something about it. And the people who are beginning to do something about it are going to be our greatest friends and allies in encouraging more people to do something about it. And I have an ambition. I mean, I think every front and back garden, for those who are lucky to have a front or a back garden where they live, should become part of a network of national front and back garden parks. Because one small practical change I made when I was the Environment Secretary after the floods was we changed the planning law, which said in future you couldn't pave over your front garden with impermeable paving. You could use permeable paving, but we knew that part of the terrible floods of 2007 was a consequence of having paved, tarmacked and concreted over large parts of our towns and cities. And when a lot of water fell out of the sky on Sheffield, believe you me, Sheffield flooded because there was nowhere else for the water to go. So it's a practical problem, and in letting the soil breathe and hopefully planting some plants to delight in, or grow some tomatoes or some cucumbers to enjoy with your tea, then everybody begins to see the contribution that each of them can make. And we need a hell of a lot more trees. And if it's a choice between moving house, if you live down here on the seafront in Brighton, because if climate change runs away and the sea level rises, Brighton's moving house. Bangladesh is moving house. Many coastal cities around China are moving house. Eventually, the 2 million people who live in the floodplain in London, including the Prime Minister in Downing Street, because Downing Street is in a floodplain, they could be moving house too. Now, we all know what a pain in the backside moving house is, so why don't we avoid that by getting on with the task in hand? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And in my late arrival, I didn't have a chance to introduce you properly, but what a wonderful Secretary of State you were. And can I also say, having watched you as chair of the Brexit Select Committee, you've been inspirational to colleagues, and your forensic questioning, I think, as you said, politics can make a difference, and my goodness, you have been making a difference. Let's hope that it comes to a successful fruition. I don't know who's spoken already, so who's next?
Just the two of
None of you, right, okay. Well, shall we go along the table in that case? Another of my inestimable colleagues from Parliament, Helen Goodman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Normally, when people think about Labour constituencies, they think about the rundown inner city areas. But my constituency of Bishop Auckland is the largest seat that Labour holds in England. It's 300 square kilometres, and it goes right up into the middle of the Pennines, and it incorporates part of the North Pennines AOMB. And the bird life is fantastic. There are curlews, there are oyster catchers. We've had a very successful black grouse project. There are lapwing, and the biodiversity is spectacular. It is in fact unique. There are plants in Teesdale which grow in Teesdale and in Iceland, and those are the only places that you can find them. But even though it's incredibly beautiful and very rich, things are not going so well. I was first elected in 2005, and I can remember going up onto one of the moors in the middle of the election campaign. It was a safe seat in those days, so you could take time off to go for walks and go up on the moors. And the whole moor was full of lapwing. Now, if you go up today, there are lapwing, but the whole moor is not full of them. And this is deeply, deeply alarming, and it brings home to all the people who live in Teesdale that this climate crisis is upon us now. And it's not just upon us now in sub-Saharan Africa, it's upon us now in the Pennines in this country. I'm very glad you spoke about peat, because this is our carbon sink, and it is, as you described with your numbers, hugely important. The peat has been washed away in the North Pennines slowly for over 200 years, because what happened was that people dug into the peat when they were lead mining in the 18th century. And so we now have a programme which is called Blocking the Grips, which is to keep the peat on the moor. And I can remember coming to see Hilary when he was Secretary of State and asking him to do more about this. And unfortunately, things are not going very well on this front. And I was challenging Michael Gove about this in the chamber. And at the moment, although this is our major carbon sink, and as you say, it's worth 4 years' worth of emissions for the whole of the rest of the economy, and it's 10% of our emissions today, the government is spending £6 million on the peat restoration projects. I mean, it's absolute chicken feed. It is completely disgraceful, and we've really got to see something done about this. I want to put in a plea for the farmers in the Uplands. This isn't just because there are 400 farmers in my constituency and I need every vote that's going. It's because the truth of the matter is we're not going to be able to look after the Uplands without the cooperation of the sheep farmers. And I've just been talking to the Vegan Society, and of course they think that nobody should eat any meat at all, including no British lamb. And they think that we can persuade the farmers to become like park keepers and not keep farming. Personally, I think that is wholly unrealistic. And I don't even believe that it's necessary. Because in 2006, another thing the Labour government did was update the Commons law. Now, the Commons Law had had a good run. The last time that we had addressed the management of the Commons in Parliament was 1383. But we felt that it was time to have another look at the way we were managing the Commons. And when we were doing this, some very bright spark did a piece of work where they looked at where all the Commons in England are and where all the SSIs are. And the match was absolutely phenomenal. They really do overlap, which tells us that if we farm in a way which is responsible for everybody in the community, then we can preserve the biodiversity. The reason that the Commons have the best biodiversity is because blogs cannot exploit some piece of land without annoying his neighbour. And he knows that he doesn't want them to be over-farming and exploiting the land in a short-term way. So he's going to behave responsibly, and then everybody behaves responsibly. So here we are. The Commons have been in existence for 800 years in this country, and they are the locations of the best SSIs. One of the things, when I say, well, I think, you know, we need to have a collaborative relationship with the farmers, people then say to me, people are incredibly unsympathetic to the farming community in this country. They say, well, they all voted for Brexit, it's their fault, why should we bother about them? Which actually isn't true, because on the night of the referendum, when we were standing in the leisure centre looking at the boxes that were being opened, you can, of course, see which boxes are where the leave votes are tumbling out and where the remain votes are tumbling out. And I have to say that it was in the rural part of my constituency, up Teesdale, where people were voting remain. And my experience of the hill farmers in the uplands is that they do understand the value of belonging to the European Union. And there are three things in particular which they are concerned about losing if we were to crash out on a no-deal basis. The first thing, obviously, is the land market in Europe. That would be catastrophic financially for them overnight. The second fantasy that has been sold to them that they know is totally unrealistic is to slash and burn all the regulation. And they know that that's not feasible because they still want to sell into other markets, so they know that that's not possible. And the third is the issue of the agricultural support mechanisms. So, although of course it's possible we could rejig the payment scheme and we could have more payments for public goods and everybody would be happy with that. The fact of the matter is that what was sold to the public was we can have much lower payments to farmers. Well, that might be true of barley barons in some parts of the country, which Sandy can tell us about, but it certainly isn't true in the uplands. And the reason this connects to the climate change agenda is that if the farmers are not sustainable financially, they cannot do the work to be sustainable on an environmental basis. So I think we need to have a much more sympathetic and much more collaborative approach with the hill farmers and with the rural communities. I'm in the Shadow Foreign Office team, and I just want to say one thing about the international negotiations on climate commitments from individual countries. The major problem, it seems to me, with the Paris Agreement is that what was offered by countries was offered on an entirely voluntary basis. And that means that countries can do something if they feel like it, and if they don't feel like it, if it's not convenient, or if it's not politically possible, well, then they can just walk away and move away from it. And one of the great things about what Greta Thunberg has said is that we need to look at what is scientifically necessary, not at what is politically possible. And I think not having legally binding commitments is deeply, deeply problematic. And I'll give you an example of the hypocrisies and the way they play out in the international community. So, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the international community introduced sanctions against the Russians. Fine, okay, I'm not criticising that. Perfectly sensible policy. When the Canadians exited the Kyoto Agreement, no action at all was taken, none whatsoever. They're still our best of buddies. They were not, they didn't face any penalty at all. So I think that as well as having the local micro policies, which we need in our communities, we also need a much stronger, a much firmer, a more legally binding approach at the international level. Thank you very much.
So much, Helen. Now, I think if we continue along the table, I'm delighted to welcome my near neighbour. I tell you, if you're a Labour MP in the east of England, your near neighbours are quite a long way away sometimes. But a joy for me to have Sandy elected 2 years ago, a good friend of SERA, a good friend of mine for many, many years, and a member of the DEFRA team. So here from the Shadow team, Sandy Martin MP for Ipswich.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I'm actually here in loco Sue Haymanensis. I'm not going to try and do Sue's voice or wear a wig or anything, but I think I could try and talk to you about the sheep farming in the uplands of Ipswich, but I think that would probably not work. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to read what Sue would have said. And I think that's the sensible thing to do. So this year marks the 70th anniversary of the passing of the Landmark 1949 National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. And that act laid down the blueprint for our national parks, of which there are now 15 across Britain. Lewis Silkin, Clement Attlee's Minister for Town and Country Planning, introduced the bill to the House of Commons, describing it as a people's charter for the open air, for the hikers and the ramblers, for everyone who loves to get out into the open air and enjoy the countryside. Silkin spoke of the many places where access to the countryside was difficult. For instance, in the High Peak, where often the only contact with the lovely countryside is the remote one of being able to look at it from roads, despite the fact that there are millions of people living in conditions of great congestion within 25 miles of the Peak District, whose only outlet to the countryside practically is in that area. The Labour government's aims of the bill were clear: to preserve and enhance the beauty of the countryside and to enable people to see it, get to it, and enjoy it. In 2000, Labour then brought forward the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. The minister responsible, the late Michael Meacher, said in his speech on the bill, "It finally achieves the aims and aspirations of the 1949 Act for full rights of access to the beauties of our countryside, to which we are all heir. It offers all people greater freedom to explore the open countryside, but, and just as importantly, to strengthen protection of our national heritage. It finally brings to reality the dream of Lloyd George that nobody should be a trespasser in the land of their birth." That 2000 Act introduced the hugely popular right to roam, delivering permanent public access to the countryside on an unprecedented scale. It granted right of access on foot to 4 million acres of the British countryside for the first time in centuries. The natural environment and our precious countryside should be an asset for everyone. Those who live and work on the land, those who want to enjoy access to our finest landscapes, and those who are anxious to strengthen the protection of our biodiversity and natural heritage. National parks are enjoyed by millions of people from home and abroad every single year, with tourism providing the bedrock for many local economies within the parks and sustaining many thousands of jobs. The state of our environment has been in the headlines a lot recently. Nearly 5 months ago, the House of Commons unanimously passed Labour's landmark motion declaring a state of climate and environment emergency. This means that the government has a little over a month left to bring forward its plans for tackling the crisis that we're facing, not just here in Britain, but across the globe. And Sue didn't write this, but don't hold your breath. Make no mistake, British nature is facing an unprecedented crisis. Animal populations are in free fall, Precious, irreplaceable habitats across the country are being lost. Organisations tasked with a legal duty to protect our natural environment, such as the Environment Agency and Natural England, have been systematically cut by this government to the bone since 2010. The Labour movement has a long tradition of environmental protection, from the establishment of the national parks through to the pioneering Climate Change Act under the leadership of Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband and Hilary Benn. I'm proud of everything Labour has achieved on our environment, particularly when it comes to our precious national parks. They're the jewel in the crown of the British countryside, internationally renowned, and I want to see us do everything in our power to protect them and enhance them for future generations. I want my children and grandchildren to be able to continue to fully access and enjoy our national parks. To conclude, I'd like to again quote Lewis Silkin's speech on the Landmark Bill in 1949. The enjoyment of our leisure in the open air and the ability to leave our towns and walk on the moors and in the dales are just as much a part of the positive health and well-being as are the building of hospitals or insurance against sickness. By preserving and developing the beautiful parts of our countryside, we are seeking to promote happiness for ordinary men and women. The 1949 Act was a people's charter for the open air, for hikers and ramblers, and for everyone who wants to get out into the open air and enjoy the British countryside. Our next Labour government has to be as radical as its predecessors. We have to leave no stone unturned in the fight to protect our natural world, be it from climate change or deforestation, so that future generations can benefit from British nature just as we have. We know that we are facing an environmental emergency, but it's not too late to do something about it. Only Labour can turn around this right-wing Tory government's reckless and ruinous approach to our natural world. Our Green Transformation Policy document, launched here at conference last year, set out our priorities and principles for environmental action, preventing and adapting to climate change, achieving high air and water quality for all, reversing the decline of biodiversity, and protecting natural habitats. And this was just the beginning of Labour's plan to restore our environment. It is working people that benefit most when our common spaces flourish. Strong environmental policy is a matter of justice, and ensuring that communities can enjoy our countryside must always be a priority for our party and our movement. I will continue to work hard to ensure that it is. And I just want to add a couple of points to Sue's speech, if I may. There is an absolutely vital part to be played in Uplands with carbon sequestration. We had a meeting here this morning on carbon sequestration, and clearly there is a massive natural form of carbon sequestration done by plants. We must, for the sake of the planet, protect and restore peat bogs, forests. There's plenty of sequestration within meadowlands. Obviously, animals that are fed on meadows rather than on artificially grown food, that is helping with carbon sequestration as well. And we need to have the financial incentive to preserve and enhance that sequestration, whether that's in this country or indeed in other countries. The burning of forests in Brazil is a massive wake-up call to the whole world. We need to have mechanisms in place to ensure that people benefit from protecting the environment. And that is just as true in this country. If we want stewardship of the uplands, we have to make it possible. There has to be the support necessary for those stewards. And with that, I will sit down and leave it to one of those stewards.
Well, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Sue, for that. And I'm very much over to one of those stewards. Neil, you're very welcome to take the floor. Neil.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to both Beccy and to Daniel for the introductions, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's an absolute honour to be in this kind of company, but you'll have to promise to be gentle with me. As Beccy said and Daniel said, my name is Neil Heseltine, and I live and work at Hilltop Farm in Malham on the southern edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park with my partner Lee, and we have a young daughter Violet. Hilltop Farm has been in one side of our family or the other since the 1901 census, and I'm obviously very proud of that history and the cultural heritage of upland farming generally. Quite literally at times, following in the footsteps of my father and grandfathers as we shepherd the hills. Having said that, the vast majority of work is now done on a quad bike, so it has lost a certain amount of its romantic appeal. And it's probably the reason that I'm 2 stone heavier than my father was at the same age. But that's probably just indicative of society in general. The perceived wisdom is that nothing really changes, and that upland farming has been exactly the same for generation after generation. But when you actually look back in history, you see that upland farming and what it produces has continually changed, and evidence of this is still etched in the landscape. We have lynchets, which date back to medieval times, areas of hillside levelled out by hand to grow oats, corn and vegetables, essentially subsistence farming to give each village food security. Sheepfolds are dotted around the countryside into which monks would gather sheep to milk, which they would then sell along with the cheese made from it. As time moved on, it became the wool from those same sheep that became the more valuable product as demand rose. And huge wealth from the woolen industry was used to build the likes of Bolton and Fountains Abbey. Competition of fine wools from abroad and a switch in focus to meat production for growing domestic urban markets led to an increase in the barns and the walls that are such an iconic feature of the Dales today. Meat production then intensified post-war, and it is only in recent times that red meat production has come under pressure for a variety of reasons. So upland farming has continually changed throughout history, and those changes have been brought about as a reflection of what was happening in society at the time and the changing demands of that society. So it isn't something that should be feared. In fact, it should be welcomed. I feel we are now on the cusp, or possibly right in the midst, of our next shift in emphasis. We are at a pivotal and a critical time. Global society is currently facing its 2 biggest challenges, probably since World War II, namely climate emergency and biodiversity decline. And certain methods of food production have contributed to this. Over the last 10 years or so, we as a family have changed our farming methods to reduce our environmental impact and to promote biodiversity. But we have to take this further and contribute to the solution as a responsible business. So we're now looking at our farm and asking ourselves, just what is our hill capable of? Capable not only in its ability to produce healthy food, but alongside that, its ability to capture carbon, its ability to deliver biodiversity, its ability to slow water flow. 8 of the rivers that flow from the Yorkshire Dales National Park end up in the River Ouse that flows through and regularly floods York. What's the hill's ability in providing health and well-being? To educate and to celebrate cultural heritage. These all have a value to society and can therefore contribute to what the hill's worth. The uplands have been of critical importance throughout their history in their contribution to society, but we might just be reaching their most valuable period. Adjustments to how we farm can increase the land's capability to mitigate climate change and deliver biodiversity, among others, and therefore be of greater value to society and farmers than at any other time previously. National parks see this as an opportunity and are confident that by being able to design and deliver locally based schemes which recognise these outcomes, this can be achieved, and therefore help to retain their farming families and communities. As farmers, we need to grasp the nettle, almost literally, and embrace change as we have done continually down the years. But most importantly, we need you, the politicians, to create the opportunity to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. I think very warmly received and a wonderful picture of your farm and a note of optimism there at the end, but also a challenge to people. Look, friends, we've got about 20 minutes to take some contributions and questions. If you could keep the questions short and perhaps say who they're directed at, that'd be helpful because it's quite a big panel. Yes, gentleman there and right at the back.
Thanks very much.
Sorry. Sorry, yes, you first and then the person at the back.
Yeah, sorry. Right, my name's Rob Walker. I'm a councillor in Kirklees in West Yorkshire. I'm also a member of the Peak District National Park, and I'm the Vice Chair of Moors for the Future. I'm involved in Natural Flood Management Operation Group in the moorland in West Yorkshire. And what I'm interested in is if and when we get a new Labour government, what can we do to make it easier to manage the uplands to benefit us in terms of climate change emergency? There are at the moment definitely things which are holding us back that we can do better. One is the relationship with the agricultural community. Absolutely vital that we work closely with farmers, and we need to look at things like agricultural payments for farmers. We also need to look at the regulations which are covering all sorts of things and can become a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare for groups trying to work on projects such as rewilding areas, tree planting, and even looking at things like moorland restoration. My practical experience recently has been that we are spending far too much time and too much money on the planning phase and not enough on the actual doing phase. And it's too easy for things to happen that can derail things that have been planned for and have been funded. So what can we do to get more done more easily?
Very good question. Right, so the gentleman at the back, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you. So I let North in first. Phil Belden, Sussex Wildlife Trust, used to be part of the campaign to get the South Downs made a national park. My question really is, post the Glover report, which has just come out, what Labour's plans are when it gets into government. Because to me, the critical thing is, there's a lot of good stuff in Glover. It talks about new national parks, like Dorset, for example, and from the peaks in 51 to the South Downs in 2009, all Labour national parks. So I'm looking forward to see what Labour is going to do with that Glover report and its suggestion for that. It talks about 1,000 rangers. That was the big headline that was a few weeks ago. Land management incentives, not just for rangers, but farmers as well, with the agri-environment schemes post the EU and Brexit, which is deeply worrying to me at the moment. And on the South Downs, as opposed to the Uplands, we do have our barley barrens, and the big concern we've got down here with the sheep farming is that we've got permanent grassland, which is great. Permanent grassland is also a great carbon sink, good for biodiversity. It's the most diverse habitat in northwest Europe, chalk grass, and you can get 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 different species within a square metre. It's phenomenally diverse. But what does it cover? 4% of the entire South Downs. And it's not just a carbon sink, it's also the aquifer for the drinking water for everybody here. So all the water you're drinking, if it's coming out of the tap, comes straight out the chalk aquifer. 1.2 million people rely on that chalk aquifer. It doesn't rely on it being polluted by loads and loads of artificial chemicals. So what I want to see really is, can Labour, please, from the front bench, Hilary and others, let me know what it's going to do with that Glover report, because I want to see it as a Glover plus, if you like. So over to you.
And over here. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. So I'm Tim from the Vegan Society, and I wanted to address Helen's point in part about farmers becoming kind of park rangers. That's absolutely not what we want to suggest. These have to be productive landscapes still. I was really grateful for actually Neil's comments about the sort of various interesting things he's doing with his farm. But you also mentioned Greta Thunberg's comments about the fact that we need to follow the scientific evidence and not just do what's politically possible. The latest IPCC report did advocate and suggest a transition away from diets that are heavily dependent on beef and lamb, red meats. So as a society, we do need to reduce the amount of red meat in the system. And if we're serious about tackling climate change, we need to reduce the amount of animals that are on our landscapes. We need to reduce the amount of animals in the system. So my question is, are we willing to follow the evidence and actually address that point?
Thank you. Now, given we've got lots of people, I'm not going to get everyone to answer every question. I'm going to suggest that one was probably aimed at Helen. I suspect at some point, and Sandy's going to have to respond on behalf of the front bench, although I'm sure Hilary's got some expertise from the past he might be able to offer. And I wonder if Beccy might want to say something about the Glover report and the general kind of response to it. So, Helen, do you want to start off?
Yeah, okay. We're in agreement that we need to shift the way people eat. And that's common ground. I just want to make a really practical suggestion. I'm sure no one, apart from me, in this room today has ever needed to cut down on the amount of alcohol that they drink. But if you have ever needed to cut down on your alcohol, you get those charts that say a glass of white wine equals however many units it is, I can't even remember. A glass of gin, 3 times as much, and all this. And you can actually use it to take sensible decisions about what you consume. Well, maybe we should start doing that with food and meat and the carbon content, because then people could think, oh, right, I want to get down from however many units it is to something else. This would be a route for me. So I think we need to sort of start doing really practical things and giving people tools that they can use to make good choices.
I didn't spend as much time as either Sue or David Drew, our Agriculture Minister, but we've spent a significant amount of time, and a lot of our workforce and a lot of civil servants have spent a very considerable amount of time on working up an agriculture bill for this country. We need an agriculture bill if we're going to leave the European Union. And to be perfectly honest, I think we need an agriculture bill even if we're not going to leave the European Union. We need to have a more sustainable agriculture, but in particular, we need to have a pricing mechanism and a sustainable mechanism which actually encourages sustainable agriculture rather than unsustainable intensive agriculture. And that's partly what I meant when I said if we're going to have stewardship, we need to actually support the stewards. So, I mean, we put forward all sorts of amendments to Gove's Agriculture Act. I know it was Gove, and I know, we all love to hate some people, but the fact is there was a lot of good in that Agriculture Act. It would have been better if our amendments had been put through. It doesn't even look as if the original act is now going to go through. It is extraordinary. So much legislation has been dropped as a result of the proroguing of Parliament and the situation over Brexit. I don't know how the government is going to cope with agriculture without an Agriculture Act if we crash out of the European Union without a deal. If I was a farmer, I would be very, very worried indeed. And that doesn't depend on whether I was an upland farmer or a so-called barley baron. It is going to be a really, really difficult time for agriculture unless we can get our act in gear. And as towards farmers becoming park rangers, no, we need food, we need agriculture, but we need the agriculture to be sustainable. And actually at the moment, the financial regime in agriculture does not incentivize sustainability, and it needs to.
Glover, yeah, and then I'm going to say a little bit about your point about, trying to make it all happen and how hard it is. So Glover, I think, obviously it only came out Saturday morning. I've seen quite a lot of comments welcoming it. I think it's got some really good, imaginative ideas in it, which is fantastic to see, and it was a good panel that put it together. We were really pleased to see the RSPB, to see kind of nature coming through really strongly, and the function of national parks and AOMBs around restoring nature. And we were also pleased that the climate crisis kind of ran through it a bit like a stick of rock. That came up a lot. It had some great ideas about diversity of access, so responding to kind of Sandy's points around how we get our national parks and AOMBs genuinely being for everyone. And there were some strong ideas around that. I have a slight question mark over the idea of a new body that's going to somehow kind of, make all this happen, particularly when we know that, bodies like Natural England, playing to Helen's point, have, really had their funding cut over the last few years. So I have a question mark over that, and it's kind of like lots of good ideas, but it's all up to some new body to make them happen. And I suppose our biggest disappointment at the RSPB was around the title of this session, actually. It's the Uplands. So we think there are some very specific issues around the Uplands that we felt that the Glover Review didn't tackle sufficiently. And those were around kind of intensity of land use and how we're going to make that shift. So a curate's egg, I think, some really good parts, some really good ideas. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Can we make it happen? Is it going to get the investment it needs to be made to happen? And I'm feeling that the Uplands was a bit ducked, actually. So those are my thoughts on Glover. In terms of how we kind of make it all happen, I read a great essay last week about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, and that's kind of where I think a lot of people find themselves around the climate crisis at the moment, which was Hilary's point. I think it is about, a lot of it is around kind of political and policy will to make it all align and make it easier to happen. I can't speak an enormous amount from my RSPB experience, having only been in the job a month, but I know from my previous Woodland Trust experience, trying to get more trees into cloughs, for example, in the Peak District, which I'm sure is what you're worried about. It's kind of, there are a lot of hoops to jump through. Now, some of those hoops are absolutely there for the right reason, and with my RSPB hat on, I would say, and with my Woodland Trust hat on, we were always strongly supportive of the need for EIAs and so on when you're going to do that kind of change to a landscape. But I think we can make those processes work faster. The processes themselves are good, but we need to make them work faster in terms of arriving at decisions and therefore getting moving on some of this. Because we do know that when nature comes back, it comes back fast. You've only got to look at somewhere like Knepp to see how fast that change has happened in terms of a rewilded landscape, for example. But we do need to get cracking on it, because otherwise we've got till, I think we were saying 2030, we've got a kind of 66% chance of keeping below 2 degrees if we do all of this. So we've got to get a move on. So we've got to get the will, the political will, to align all of that and align the funding behind it as well. So I think in my view, it's that.
Now, we're very tight on time, so I'm going to take 3 questions and then bring Neil and Hilary in. So the woman in red at the back and then 2 at the front. Just say it's very good to be joined by one of our great environmental campaigners in the House of Commons, Kerry McCarthy, one of the Bristol MPs. You've got your question.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Ingrid Allen, delegate for Worthing West, and I also have the great honour to be our SERA representative within the CLP, which, we voted completely unanimously for affiliation. I have the good fortune or misfortune, depending on your perspective, to live with an ornithologist, and yes, and he. So a lot of our social circle is made up of members of the bird watching community. Most of them are, largely left-leaning and kind of pro-Remain, but very apolitical. And whenever I ask them why, I always get the same answer, that on the whole, our party is backing the right kind of big changes in terms of the environment, but they don't see anyone in politics caring about, individual species loss and habitat loss, and the fact that we've lost, half of our farmland birds since the 1950s. So I'm delighted to hear, Helen speak out in favour of the lapwings and the curlews, and, but they all say, well, what about the hen harriers that are being illegally shot on game reserves, and what about all the other ground nesting species that are threatened by agriculture? So what's the party willing to do to kind of, individually support those species that are under threat, in addition to all the wonderful things they're doing already?
Very good, thank you. So here and then there.
Thank you. Hilary McGrady, Director General for the National Trust. I'm not sure that I could argue with anything that has been said today. In a way, we're almost speaking to the converted between each other, aren't we? I'm curious we've talked a lot about peat and the importance of peat. But one of the major crises with the use of peat is actually the horticultural sector and the continued use of peat within compost. We know the voluntary solution hasn't worked. It simply hasn't. And we know that there is a solution. You can quite easily grow plants in compost without peat. So what, I would say, is the Labour Party going to do about that?
Adam Deister, also National Trust. Very simple question. John McDonnell has just announced today that he'll fund sort of any means necessary to tackle climate change. We know, and as Sandy was saying, the agriculture bill with the natural climate solutions, with climate adaptation, could go a long way towards that. Will Labour therefore commit to long-term funding at least the current levels, if not more, for that?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask both Hilary and Neil to have a word. Now, I suspect in the end, Sandy's going to perhaps answer 3 very direct questions. And are you going to save endangered species, Sandy? I'm sure I know the answer. Hilary, do you want to go first on any of those?
Very quickly. Now, for my sins, I'm the water vole champion. And I think it wasn't until we were on holiday in Orkney that we actually saw a water vole whizzing across the road. But I've yet to see one in its natural habitat. But I will continue to be on the lookout. Less paperwork, more spade work, you bet. I wanted just to, I'll leave the tricky questions for Sandy, as I don't have front-bench responsibility, about flood prevention, the colleague at the back who raised it right at the beginning, because it goes to Helen's point about the moors and plugging up the drainage channels, because we have a flooding problem in Leeds. Lots of places have had flooding problems, and we've raised some walls, we've got some movable weirs in the centre of the city. But the latest part of the flood prevention scheme is to try and look upstream in terms of planting trees, slowing the water down, making sure that the moors can retain the moisture so it doesn't flood into the city centre. And it's a really good example of looking at the whole impact of the way the system works, rather than just thinking, if you keep building the walls higher and higher and higher, you will deal with the problem, and it doesn't work like that. And apart from anything else, the people in the centre of Leeds who've bought their flats by the river, when you say to them, well, the wall is now going to be up here and you're just going to look at a brick wall out of your living room window, they're none too fabulously pleased about the outcome. And during my time as Environment Secretary, I visited the great big bund there is on a farmer's land outside Lincoln, as I recall, because when the river comes through the centre of Lincoln, it narrows considerably, and Lincoln had a flooding problem. And what that project does is to divert the water when it's in Speight, and it goes into the bund, and they shut the gate, and it sits there, and the farmer grows crops that can live for 3, 4, 5 days underwater at the right time of the year without too much serious damage. And when the peak has passed in the centre of Lincoln, hey presto, the gate's open, and off you go. And it's a really good example at a practical level that people can relate to of how, if you look at the whole, you can see how the bits connect, and we need to do a lot more of it.
Thank you, Hilary. I was going to say, I'd like you to have the last word, really. So Sandy can evade us spending a commitment.
Okay, I'll be very, very brief. Protecting specific bird species, you know, the best way to protect species is to prevent the harm that we've been doing to them. And there are various harms that we've been doing to them, destroying their habitat, using unhelpful pesticides in the past. And, you know, what I know we will be doing is we will be focusing on trying to make sure that we are not damaging species in that way. And if we do that, then I think that a lot of species that are currently at threat will probably do an awful lot better. There are plenty of bird species now that would be extinct already if we hadn't banned DDT, and there is more to do in that direction. On banning peat, I'm not the Shadow Secretary of State, and I'm not the Shadow Cabinet, and I can't just make policy on the hoof. But I do promise you that I will have a conversation with Sue the next time I see her, and I will suggest to her very strongly that we have a manifesto commitment to ban peat, because I think it would be a really good idea. And finally, just very briefly on Adam's point, I can't say that, Adam. You know I can't say that. Even Sue couldn't say that. But we are really committed to a sustainable agriculture in this country. We're really committed to growing food in this country, and we want to make sure that the two fit together. And I know you know that. And I can't act as Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, but I'm sure we're on the same wavelength.
One sentence from Beccy and then Neil.
I was just going to use the example, actually. So one of my best friends is married to a sheep farmer in Teesdale, and they have curlew that nest on the farm, which is fantastic. They get very angry about the the moors where they have kind of shared common rights being used for shooting, being used for a commercial shoot, and the way in which agricultural payments at the moment go to that land as well as to their land where they feel they have a concern that requires that payment in order to deliver what it's there to deliver. So I think it is an absolute mess at the moment, you know, and we are using our money, our agricultural funding, to drive absolutely the wrong outcomes because, of course, hen harriers, we know, are one of the birds that are tremendously effective by the intensity of driven commercial shooting in this sector. So, you know, we really need to sort this out. It may take a bill. I think there are things we could probably do outside a bill to sort it out, but we need to sort this out because at the moment we are driving all the wrong outcomes. We have money to play with, we have money to do the right stuff, and we're driving the wrong outcomes at the moment.
And finally, the last word for Neil. What would you like to see a Labour government doing?
I, like a few of these up here, have been encouraged by the 25-year environment plan, the health and harmony report and the ag bill. I know that that's been sort of sidelined for now, but that's been consistent in its environmental message, and I'm been as surprised as probably most of you in this room that those sort of things were coming out of Michael Gove's mouth, to be honest with you. But on the current timetable, time is starting to run short. Now, there might be a massive shake-up on that, but time's running short, and as farmers, we need that process to be continued, and we need that consistent message. So it's good to hear what these guys are saying, because it sounds like they are along the same sort of lines of where Michael Gove was, which you can't say a lot. That happens a great deal of the time. But yeah, it's great to see, and it's great to hear assurances that we are going along those environmental lines, because I think, as we've all said all day, that it's absolutely critical that we get that right.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being a great audience. Can I finally say, most of you will know about SERA, Labour's environmental campaign, for almost half a century. Can I encourage those of you who aren't members to get involved? Can never be a more important time than now for SERA to be flourishing. There's huge interest. And perhaps you can show your appreciation for a truly fantastic panel.